All right, today we're going to return to a discussion of Boyd's Discourse on Winning and Losing, and also I'm going to talk about some other ideas about war, some of them from this book, Cocktails from Hell. It is not a recipe book. However, it's written by Austin Bay, who is a prominent military strategist and actually an adjunct professor here who occasionally teaches in Plan 2. So we're going to look at some of his views on military strategy, some of which he's developed himself and some of which come from some Chinese theorists, Chao and Wang, who wrote a book called Warfare Without Limits, I guess is the one translation, the other Unrestricted Warfare. And so I want to try to understand a few themes that emerge from a variety of these sources. We've talked about the conception of the world, at least as it's relevant to conflict, underlying these kinds of questions, that it's many-sided, that it's rapidly changing, highly unpredictable. And maybe a good place to start, in fact, is with something that Bay talks about. There are certain problems he calls wicked problems. This is not exactly wicked in the sense of evil, neither is it wicked in the Boston slang sense of very. First time I went to New England and played hockey with people, somebody said, "That's a wicked good shot." And I thought, what are you talking about? But wicked in Boston just means very. Well, that's not what this means. What is a wicked problem? It has no particular moral dimension necessarily. What it really just means is that there's a multitude of variables, and these variables are interdependent to varying degrees. So there are a lot of things to keep track of. If you were trying to trace, in other words, the structure of this, you would have to do it with a sort of a set of multivariate equations. I mean, it's a very complicated sort of set. A lot of things are relevant to it. A lot of them depend on other things. There are complicated connections here. You can't really isolate them. Moreover, the situation is dynamic. It keeps changing. And so you think you've got it pinned down, and then it changes again. And a lot of what's changing it is really driven by chance. Now, of course, it's not all chance. Some of it is a question of good and bad strategy, good and bad coordination, good and bad implementation, and so forth. But there's a certain just chance element to it. All of that means not only that this is largely unpredictable, but that it resists analytic framing. How is it that we understand certain problems? We typically have frames. We have schemata, to use Ulrich Neisser's terms. We have scripts, to use Roger Schenck's. We have these ways of understanding situations, and we try to assimilate things to one of these cognitive frames, to one of these cognitive models. Well, these are things where it's very hard to find a model. There are too many things going on, and we don't really have an adequate cognitive model for them in the first place. Now, to give you an idea of what I mean, I think Neisser and Schenck and a whole variety of other people who talk in terms of things like schemata or frames or models are really thinking of similar kinds of ideas. We have certain structures in our head that allow us to analyze a situation. Go back to your math classes from high school or even elementary school. You're given some word problem. Remember word problems? Okay, how do you go about solving a word problem in math? Yeah.
You translate it into math.
Good, you translate it into math, right? You realize, oh, this is something that the question is really about geometry. It's really about trigonometry and the relationship between these angles. Or it's really just a quadratic equation, or whatever it is. You go through and you think, how do I represent this in mathematical terms? And then you realize, I have a way of doing that. I don't know if any of you have ever taken engineering physics. Part of the reason it's so much harder than regular physics is that it includes stuff from the real world that ordinary physics doesn't. When I studied physics, it was it was awesome. They were just point masses moving through frictionless space, right? And so I thought I was really good at physics. And then my daughter took engineering physics and said, can you help me with these problems? I looked at it like, wait, there's friction in this universe? Falling objects have air resistance? You mean like, wait, it matters how much contact there is between this and the surface? It's like, I don't know how to do any of that. I mean, that has to do with the real world. I didn't have the proper analytic frames for that. And so that's something, and a lot of people find word problems hard, right? Why? Because you have to figure out what the right frame is for that problem. Well, the same thing is true for lots of other things. You walk into a situation and you're immediately trying to classify that situation. You walk into a room full of people. Maybe you weren't expecting them to be there, and you think, what are these people doing? Right? And you're searching for one of these schemata that you can use to understand what's happening. Is this some kind of party? Are these people gathering before an academic talk? Is this some kind of protest that's about to start? What am I encountering here, right? And on a college campus, there could be lots of different things that you're encountering. And you think, what's the appropriate frame for understanding this? So the problem with these wicked problems is precisely we don't have a frame for them. Now why? Partly because there are too many things going on. It is difficult, but they're dynamic. They keep changing. That's part of the reason that speed and intuitive responses and getting inside the opponent's OODA loop and keeping up with the change ourselves, even if it's not the opponent, just think the world is the opponent. Keeping up our responses quickly enough to understand the changes, that's really vital. And it's not just that it's chance, which is creating a certain level of uncertainty. It's partly that it just resists the frame. You don't know what's going on. Now, why does it resist the frame? It's partly that there are so many things going on. Okay? There are too many variables. So what are the kinds of things that might be going on? What sorts of dimensions are there? Now, they, relying on the work of Chow and Wang, developed something that is popular among military analysts now. Military analysts, by the way, are very fond of acronyms and letter combinations, right? Government, you might say in general, is. There are all these alphabet agencies in Washington, but the same thing is true of the military. And so a classic one is DIME. What does that stand for? Well, basic tools, basic dimensions of a problem. They correspond also to kinds of conflict. So what is the D? That's diplomacy. The I is intelligence or information. Here we'll distinguish those. M, well, that's an obvious one. That's just military power. The E is economic. And all of those are important dimensions of real international problems, but also real conflict problems involving a lot of organizations, just in business or in other kinds of contexts. Some of it is a question of, okay, we're having a conflict and we're in discussions, negotiations to try to resolve it. Some of it is, there's a conflict involving information. We believe different things. We have different sets of facts. Or maybe I'm trying to deceive you because we're in competition. Some of it is just a question of power. Now, ordinarily, companies don't have military forces. That's up in distinctive countries. But sometimes these things get mixed up. My next door neighbor for a while was an oil and gas attorney who was going to Russia. This was after the fall of the Soviet Union, helped them set up an oil and gas industry. And he came back for Christmas one year and found he had no job to go back to. Why? Because the mob had moved in and taken over the oil fields and taken over the entire company where he worked. And so it was like, well, okay. Goodbye job, goodbye, goodbye oil field, everything. And that was done through force. Admittedly, not exactly military force, more like criminal gang force, but nevertheless, force. And then, of course, there are economic conflicts, which are common in the business world, but also prominent on the intellectual, or on the international stage. But then there are other things. So Bay continues this with filch. That doesn't really, I mean, dime is easy to remember, right? In fact, you can make all sorts of jokes. Oh, there's not a dime's worth of difference or something. But I guess here, filch. I don't really get it. Think of somebody stealing your dime, maybe? I'm not sure. Anyway, what does this mean? Well, financial. Now, you could think of that as a subset of economic. But you also might think this is a separate kind of thing. I could engage in an economic conflict in the guise of a trade war, for example, with another company. But I can also do it by affecting the international financial system, let's say, in a way that affects international relations. The I here is intelligence. And again, you might think, well, that's really a question of information. But it's, to some extent, distinct. This is kind of what you know. This is what you infer from it, how you build that into a larger understanding of the situation. So it might be you have lots of information, but you can't organize it. You don't know what to infer from it. Think about studying for a final exam in a course where there's been a lot of relatively unstructured information. Let's say a history course where you've learned lots and lots of detail about some subject. But then it's a question of, on a final exam, I actually have to answer some questions and organize that. You can have lots of information that you remember, but find it very hard to organize it in a way that helps you understand things. Well, then the L is legal. So there can be legal dimensions of conflict, using international law, for example. And again, in business, there are lots of elements here of financial issues, strategies, conflicts, of intelligence, business intelligence, trying to not only get information about the potential market, about your competitors and so on, but then how do you use that to understand the marketplace, understand what kind of product would succeed. There can be all sorts of legal conflicts. The last two are interesting, I think. This one is cultural. There are a lot of cultural conflicts that really come down to something that's kind of indirect, conflict in the war of ideas. So if you think about in the business world, there are often different cultures, different companies. And to some extent, what people appeal to, right, is not just things about their product, but things about their image, their cultural significance. So, yeah, one or two competing companies that compete partly on the basis of these cultural differences. They're different kinds of companies and different kinds of people like their products. Yeah, Apple and Android. Good, Apple and Android, right? An Apple user is a certain kind of person. And an Android user is a certain kind of person. And often people resist going from one to the other for reasons that have nothing to do with the product itself, right? But it's just, no, that's who I am. What are some other examples?
Yeah, Pepsi and Coke.
Pepsi and Coke, yeah. There, the product itself is so similar, you might think, what else is there, right? I mean, it's sugary water with a sort of hard to define flavor. And so, what am I going to do about that? By the way, I've been drinking a Diet Coke upstairs, so I got to say, I don't mean what I just said to cast aspersions on those products. In fact, I discovered a new use for them today. Have you ever tasted durian? Do you know what durian is?
Is it fruit?
Yes, it's this Asian fruit that is the stinkiest fruit known to mankind. It is banned from public transportation in Singapore because it smells so terrible. Well, last night we got together to compete in a trivia contest, as usual. As usual, we didn't do all that well. We came in fourth. I mean, we did pretty well. Though the team that came in first beat the rest of us all by 20 points. Amazing. It's like the dream team of trivia nuts. Anyway, to make a long story even longer, my daughter brought along this package of cookies she had gotten in an Asian market. And she said, look, I got these cookies. I looked at them and said, yeah, durian flavor. I said, do you know what that is? She said, no, but let's open it up and find out. So she opens up the bag of cookies. Well, suddenly the entire place stinks. I was like, oh my God, take that outside, it's horrible. And then, but I figured, well, I've had to put up with this smell. I can at least try tasting. Maybe it smells terrible, but it's delicious. So I take a bite of one of these cookies. I thought, that doesn't taste like much of anything. So, and here was my big mistake. I took a second lunch. Then, this whole thing fills my head. And it stayed there until I was drinking the Diet Coke immediately before class. So, what, 15 hours later. But anyway, yeah, it's repulsive. I don't know. And it's like stays with you. And I read all these things online, like how do you get rid of the taste of durian in your head? And none of them really quite work. But anyway, Diet Coke does as well as anything else I tried, let me tell you. Better. Yeah, well, to make this longer story even longer, this is a point about genetic capacities underlying this. Is it some cultural difference that some people actually like that smell and that taste? Not really. It's kind of like cilantro. Some people have a gene that makes them taste cilantro as soapy, and some people don't. I don't have it, but that's kind of a defect. I can't taste that chemical. But my younger daughter can, so she thinks cilantro tastes like soap. Well, apparently durian is the same way. Some people have the gene that lets them smell it and have this taste sensation that I had. Other people lack that gene, and they tend to like it. Because that nastiness, they just can't sense the nastiness. So anyway, yes, there are cultural differences. They often get mixed up with all sorts of other factors, as in that case. Is it a cultural thing that some people like durian? Well, maybe some, but some of it is just. And notice, when it comes to a question like Coke versus Pepsi, since you don't have much in the way of actual information that's going to differentiate your products, you've got to rely on these cultural factors. The products are otherwise too similar. Other conflicts that are like where you've got essentially a cultural gap between the buyers of these things, much more so than an actual gap concerning needs or the characteristics of the product itself. Yeah.
This might sound really weird, but my dad's a big hunter, so within like the truck market and the gun market, it's like it says something value like the amount of gun you buy, so if you're like Remington or like for instance, or like your truck, you drive a Ford versus Chevy, it's like a really big expensive ride.
Oh. All right, good. Guns are like this. Look, I mean, you can tell I'm not a gun person, but guns are more or less all the same. I mean, you pull the trigger and you shoot. And similarly, I mean, there are significant differences among cars, but if you go to similar kinds of models, how big a difference is there between like a mid-sized Toyota and a mid-sized Mazda and a mid-sized Subaru and a mid-sized Ford and a mid-sized Chevy or something? They're very similar things, right? So what, and nevertheless, there's a big cultural difference. Okay, now I just disqualified myself, I guess, from all further discussion of automobiles and firearms, but at least you can look at those at a certain level and say, what else is there? I don't know what else there is to judge by. And indeed, buyers of those various lines of products tend to have a certain characteristic. Think of a Volvo driver. Now think of a Corvette driver. Now think of a Cadillac driver. Now a BMW owner, and so on. Different images pop in your head, and those are largely cultural things, more so than they are, well, some of it is economic and so on, but a lot is cultural. And the last part here is humanitarian. Sometimes the conflict is really at a humanitarian level. What would that mean? Well, it would mean that we are, for example, trying to send economic aid to a country to firm up an alliance to make it less vulnerable to political instability, for example. Or it could be that we're causing a humanitarian crisis there. Refugees coming from one country to another form a kind of humanitarian problem for the country the refugees are fleeing to. There are all sorts of different dimensions here. Now, what's going on? Why is that book called Cocktails for Power? Well, it's because in formulating a strategy, you have to do all these things at once, or at least some substantial subset of them at once. There are different dimensions of the problem. So take a non-military example. Suppose you are an executive at Coca-Cola, and you're thinking, we must stay ahead of Pepsi. How do we do it? Well, but, okay, we might.
Actually happened. Pepsi died.
Well, we might acquire products, and so we might think, I mean, what is that in these terms? Suppose we decide, hey, they don't have anything corresponding to this, neither do we, but we'll acquire that company, and so we'll have this new dimension of warfare we can open up on sports drinks, let's say, that our competitor doesn't. What kind of conflict is that? What are we doing there?
Trying to shift market power.
That's right, we're trying to shift market power, so to some extent that's economic. It might also be a cultural thing. What is our brand? How does our brand interact with that? Maybe it makes a lot of sense for us, and we've got something that will create a significant thing, or maybe this adds to our brand. On the other hand, sometimes this sort of thing destroys them. We're Porsche, and we introduce an SUV. I've never really understood that move. It's like, okay, that's not what I thought Porsche was. And so sometimes I think people do something that might, they think, make a lot of economic sense for them, but it creates now a cultural problem for them. Gee, that's not the image I have of what Porsche was. So it can create an issue. And the same kind of thing happens on the international scale. Think about the conflict that's been going on between the United States and North Korea. Not just now under the Trump administration, but really going all the way back to, well, 1950 and before. The Korean War never officially ended. There was just a truce, but there was no formal end to that war. Now, what kinds of things are involved in our conflict with North Korea? Conflict here, notice, not hot military action at the moment, though periodically things flare up. But there's obviously a big diplomatic dimension as people try to negotiate nuclear proliferation and other issues. There's a question of information, trying to get enough information about what's going on in North Korea to make sensible decisions. There are intelligence problems. How do you actually process that information and understand the circumstance? How do you predict what the North Korean leadership might do in response to various things? There are economic considerations involving sanctions. There is, of course, a military presence that we have on the peninsula and the South Korean army, but also Japan. A number of other countries are involved, China on the other side. There are financial questions about allowing North Korea access to financial institutions. There are sometimes legal questions, if questions come up in courts of international law. And then, of course, there are cultural questions. Part of cultural questions is what Bay refers to as narrative warfare. And that's become increasingly important. I think the importance of it was first recognized by Georges Sorel with his revolutionary syndicalism in the late 19th century. But since then, it's been a common thing, especially among Marxists who were the first maybe to seize on this and say, wait, this is a huge thing. But now, I think a lot of people realize this. People think in terms of these schemata, in terms of frames, in terms of often symbols and stories. And the idea is here, part of the reason, or part of the way in which you have a cultural impact is you tell a story. You have appropriate symbols. And so there's an attempt to shape the media narrative. So in politics now, this is a huge thing. It's all about the narrative. But for a company, it can be the same thing, okay? You tell a story about who you are, about what your product is. And especially small companies like to do this, right? When they publicize themselves, it's never just, hey, we do blah, blah, blah. It's like, hey, we make better peanuts. It's like, this all started with great-grandpa Jones, who began cooking peanuts in the back room of his little plumbing shop, and then blah, 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 blah. They tell you this story to create a certain image, to create a certain brand. Yeah?
Actually, the Los Angeles Clippers, the basketball team, they hired someone from Sports Illustrated. He's a writer, like super good storyteller, to actually work on narratives for the players, so that Los Angeles would start liking the Clippers, like moving towards the Clippers more than the Lakers. So that was one of their moves.
Oh, very nice example. Good. Yeah, suppose you are a sports team in a city with several sports teams in that sport. How do you differentiate your team, right? Why the Clippers instead of the Lakers? Why the Jets instead of the Giants? Why the Mets instead of the Yankees, et cetera, et cetera? Or the Angels instead of the Dodgers, and so on and so forth. these play, it's like, well, what are we, yeah, one might have more economic power, one might have, the equivalent of military power there is we have a better team. We may have deeper pockets, we may do better at understanding our market and so forth, but a lot of it ends up being cultural. There's just a cultural difference between the Yankees and the Mets, or between the Lakers and the Clippers, and part of the reason is, yeah, you build up this story. With the Yankees, it's easy because there's this long, long history. And so, Rick Team, Babe Ruth, Lou Gehrig, Joe DiMaggio, Roger Maris, Mickey Mantle, Whitey Ford, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And, a new team new team. I think there's a new team because I was alive when it was created. I remember that the Mets, the first year they played, they not only lost a lot of close games, which is the mark of a bad team, wrote one sports writer, they lose a lot of games by 9 or 10 runs, which is the sign of a terrible team. Casey Stengel, who was their manager, said at one point, can't anybody here play this game? And so, they had to kind of create a story out of nothing, right? Because they had no history. They didn't have it on map. Yeah.
I think the best example here for going back to North Korea would be like their propaganda, like how Kim Jong-un is a god and the Americans are these like demon monsters that are going to eat their children or something, and then we have the opposite, like we're trying to convince them that no, Kim Jong-un is bad for them.
Yeah,
Good.
their lore is amazing. Like, someone needs to hire those people to do, I don't know, world building for a fantasy novel or something. Dude, they've got, like, Kim Jong-il was born on a sacred mountain. There was, like, a double rainbow in the sky or something.
Oh, he also doesn't defecate.
Yeah, it's crazy.
Wow.
He was actually born in Russia.
Wow, okay, yes. Notice here, there is all this lore, this mythology. There is the question of symbols, of brands in the corporate world. There is a question of stories that convey a history, sometimes real stories, sometimes made-up stories. Yeah.
Well, the story you're telling is really powerful in humans, and I guess I'm wondering if you know some reasons why stories in particular impact us so much.
That's a good question. Why do stories have a bigger impact than just listing some facts or just making some claims? Yeah.
Well, stories kind of back into, like, for example, Tesla, their man of profit, continuing to come up with outrageous ideas like leaf blowers, and look at all their acquisitions. It's horrible. If you think about the company, they're essentially insolvent and reliant upon subsidies, but yet people still continue to invest in them. We should be short in their stock. And so the story really is more.
Yeah. Okay, good. Sometimes the story is meant to cover up real inadequacies. I realize, let's say, in some of the possible world, I'm a terrible philosopher. But I have to tell you some good story about why I'm here in front of the classroom. So I make up some story about my background to indicate something about why it's not only okay, but a wonderful thing that I'm here in front of the classroom. And well, isn't that what the Mets had to do? They kind of had to come up with some story, right? And in part, they just had to get a lot better. Their first season was 1962, but in 1969, they won the World Series. That was only 7 years later. And all of a sudden, they were the miracle Mets, right? And now they had a story. So, okay, from now on, no problem. And it's a story based in reality. But at first, it's kind of, we've got to have a story because otherwise, and the story to some extent was, initially, we're pathetically incompetent. You should just like us because you should feel sorry for us. We don't know what we're doing. We can't play this game. Even our own manager makes fun of us, this type of thing. And to some extent, that was a strategy. It's like, yeah, we can't play this game, but let's just admit that. And, have people laugh along with us instead of laugh at us.
And draft Nolan.
And, yes, and get Nolan Ryan. That helped a lot. So, yeah. Okay. Yeah.
That doesn't answer the original question she had, though, which wasn't why we tell stories, but
Oh,
why they're so.
Why they're so effective. Good. Thank you for bringing me back to that. So why are they more effective? Yeah.
I think stories are more effective because we don't live our lives with facts. Like you wake up, each day is almost its own mini story. And you have things that happen to you in your life. Those are experiences that are similar to stories, and stories are just relating experiences, even if they're made-up experiences.
Okay, good. Good. I think part of the reason, I mean, you're right, that our lives are lived in this serial fashion, as narratives, sort of, rather than just sets of facts. So that's part of it, I think. We're used to thinking in those terms. Also, a story, at least if it's decently told, it combines this. It's giving you information, but it's also structuring it in a way that you see the point, right? It's telling you how this happened, how this came about. It's explaining something at the same time. I don't know if you've ever, well, maybe you know people who tend to tell these stories, and they're very long-winded and they don't go anywhere. Luckily, I haven't known that many of them. But sometimes, there are people I've known who are like that. They'll start talking about something, and it just meanders on, and you keep thinking, well, why are you telling me this? What's the point, right? Well, there is no point. It just goes on, and my own grandfather was a bit this way. It was rare that he told a story, but when he did, it was often very funny. There would be funny details in it. But on the other hand, it sort of went nowhere. It was just like, here's what's happening in my neighborhood. And he was fortunate enough, if you want to put it that way, to live in a very interesting, meaning a really kind of bad neighborhood with some very questionable neighbors from a moral point of view. And yeah, some interesting things went on there. But it wasn't like, oh, let me tell you this scandalous story about my neighbor. Ha ha ha. It was more like, well, what's been going on? Oh, here. And then there were some amazing things. Wait, what? But it all just sort of rambled on, and great example of this. There's a movie by Federico Fellini, Camera. The first time most people see it, they hate it, because it's this narrative about his childhood growing up in Italy under fascism. And nothing more or less happens. I mean, it has no structure to it. There's not much of any point. And so you think, what's this movie about? I don't understand. Well, it's just a series of reminiscences. There is no point. And so I saw it and hated it. And a good friend of mine thought, well, that just shows you're a cultural Neanderthal. I want to go see it. So I went to see it with him. And halfway through, he said, oh, God, you're right. This is terrible. Let's leave. But I said, no. This time I'm really enjoying it. I made him sit through it. But the second time, it's like, okay, you realize this isn't going anywhere. Don't try to fit this into a structure. This is just reminiscences of growing up in 1930s Italy. And it's like, here's some things that happened. That's cool. And then you can just kind of enjoy it. In the middle, there's this scene where a huge ocean liner is passing by the town. You can only see it if you actually take boats out into the Mediterranean. And so the whole village does. They all go out in these boats. And there, this huge ship passes, lit up. I mean, it's nighttime. So everything's dark except for the moonlight on the water. And then this huge ship comes by. It's a very slow scene, but it's very beautiful. And the first time, you're thinking, so what's going to happen? Well, nothing's going to happen. They're going to go, and then they're going to go back to the village, right? But the second time, you're, now, here's my point. Stories that don't go anywhere like that frustrate us, because we expect that there to be a point to the story. But the story manages then to give us information, also manages to give us intelligence. It gives us an understanding. It gives us an explanation. And when it doesn't really, if it never gets to this stage, then we end up being kind of lost. Like, well, what was the point of all that? So I think the thought is a narrative doesn't just do this. It also does this. It gives you, if you will, the appropriate framing. It says, here's how to understand this. Here's how this happened. Here's what's going on. And that's very valuable to us, and that's what we really remember. So that's, anyway, I think, part of the explanation. Yeah?
I think stories do more than that, because the framing of it is just the factual side of it. I think that what they do is they incite emotion, and the emotion is what personalizes the experience, because it just just having the giving the information intelligence is sort of giving facts. I think what they do is they create this emotional tension, and that's what makes you want to believe it, and then believe the narrative and the information intelligence that it gives you.
That's true. It does give you this emotional dimension that is otherwise just going to be missing from the list of facts. Consider the difference between the kind of dry history book you might have encountered when you were growing up that just says, okay, the American Revolution, here's what happened, 1773, blah, 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 1774, blah, 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 et cetera, and just learn a bunch of facts. It's like, okay, man. And then somebody who tells you the story and says, okay, in fact, the movie, 1776, great example of telling you a story that results in the signing of the Declaration of Independence. Or someone who actually does a really good history of the Battle of Saratoga, let's say, and actually tells the story of how the various people are thinking, how the troops end up moving, why that was the crucial battle of the war. Then you see, aha, I have this story, and you remember it much better because of the emotion involved. It's not just a list of facts. You get a sense of what it was like to actually be on that side and doing those things, and winning or losing, living or dying. And so I do think it's a mistake to think of these frames as being purely analytic. That is to say, as not having an emotional element. Often they do. But you're right, the story makes the emotional element much more powerful. To go back to the example I had earlier, you walk into the room, there's a crowd of people. What emotion is appropriate to that, other than surprise that there are people there? Well, you have to, different frames will have different emotions. If this is a class about to start, you might think, oh, I shouldn't be here. If it's a talk, you might think, oh, I'm curious, what's the talk about? If it's a protest, you might think, what are you protesting? maybe yay, and maybe, and then, other things like that. What if it's a group of people who are meeting together to plan some criminal enterprise? You might think, I better get out of here. So, in short, there can be emotions connected to those frames as well. To give you an idea, we have a sort of script for entering a restaurant, we have a script for entering a hospital, and they have emotions connected to them. And going into a hospital doesn't feel nearly as pleasant to us, even in the abstract, as going into a restaurant. Okay, well, there are all of these dimensions. Now, how do we deal with all of this? What do we do? How do we construct a cocktail, which is some mix of all of these dimensions? It's a very hard thing to do. So the first point is, look, strategy involves thinking about all of these different dimensions. We sometimes talk about certain politicians or strategists, playing multidimensional chess. Bayes' point is they're all playing multidimensional chess. Some just don't realize it and don't do it very well. But if you want to be good at this, what do? How do you actually manage it? Yeah.
You figure out which tool is going to have the largest margin of utility in a specific circumstance.
Well, you do have to understand the appropriateness of different tools in different circumstances, and also the interdependencies, right? Using this tool may help your cause in this dimension, but what is it doing to it in others? Good example, economic sanctions. Sometimes they're very effective. Often they're really ineffective. Dramatic example of terrible effects of economic sanctions. France and Britain applying sanctions to Italy when Italy invaded Ethiopia in the 1930s. Okay? Point was to put pressure on the Italian economy to make Mussolini back down and stop his aggression in Africa. Is that what happened? No. Pissed off Mussolini. Mussolini had met Hitler, thought he was a jerk. Okay? He came away saying, I don't like him. He's a garrulous monk. Okay, thought he was an imbecile, basically. And something about hothead and so forth. But then, all of a sudden, he realized, wait, Germany's the only country in Europe who's now willing to be our ally. So he formed an alliance with Hitler. That turned out to be a really bad move for him and for the world. But anyway, those economic sanctions actually helped. Yeah, that's right. It drove Mussolini into that alliance and lost that potential alliance for Britain and France. So that was a case of, wait a minute, okay, maybe it works to put some crimp in the Italian economy. It didn't actually do much. But on the other hand, it led to a very significant diplomatic loss. So you've got to think about the effect all of these things are going to have. So you're right, you need to think about what tools you have to address these things, but then think, and what does the use of that tool mean for the rest? Think about what it does to the narrative. Okay, we can do this, but what does that do to our brand image, the company might say? What happens if we start suing all our competitors? Maybe it's a good move from a legal point of view. Maybe it ties them up in court, delays their product launch, gives us an economic advantage. But what if we get the reputation for being jerks as a result of it? So we got to be careful about those things. Okay, that's one thing. What are some other things that are important? Yeah.
This is kind of a weird analogy, but using quality liquor, if we're talking about cocktails, I guess quality liquor would mean kind of knowing what each thing is and understanding the roots of it. So like understanding the kind of vodka you're putting in a cocktail would be like understanding the roots of diplomacy, where its foundations, and applying that to like really where you're going. So kind of like in the corporate world, doing your due diligence.
Right, okay, good. Yeah, we need to be concerned. I guess I should be writing these down with the tools. We need to be concerned about the quality. And one way to put this is we need to focus on the resources that all these will take and just how good our resources are in that dimension, right? You're not going to get a better vodka martini unless you use better vodka. You're not going to get a really good margarita unless you use decent tequila. So similarly, you might think, yeah, how good is my military? How much economic power do I actually have in this situation? How good is my intelligence? And you might find these are very different, among different countries in quality. The United States, how strong are we in these dimensions?
We don't have those diplomats.
We're pretty damn good in those two then.
We're pretty good in a lot of these. We have a lot of economic power, a lot of financial power. The military, well, it depends, it used to be stronger, but it's still quite strong. We tend to have horrible intelligence. I mean, the intelligence community has gotten every big question wrong in my lifetime. Vietnam, oh, that'll be easy. And then the Soviet Union, oh, they're a much more powerful country and much, much stronger economy than ours. Or gosh, back in 1960, the big debate between Kennedy and Nixon was about the missile cap. That we had so many fewer missiles than the Soviet Union. None of that was true. And it wasn't a question of the politicians lying. The intelligence community was just horribly deceived. And sadly, they've been horribly deceived about almost everything. The weapons in Iraq, I mean, every big call, essentially, since World War II has been wrong.
Just thinking about the spies in the white, like the outer his stuff they missed.
Well, that's true. We can keep going back. I mean, it's not just since World War II.
All these AIDS, all these moles, awful.
That's true. Yeah, I mean, the Roosevelt administration was crawling with Soviet spies. So the intelligence agencies have been terrible for a very long time. And so you can think about all of those and think, what are the quality of our ingredients, the quality of our tools? Where are the tools appropriately used? Notice if this is rapidly changing, all the stuff we were talking about before continues to be the case. We've got to rely on speed. We've got to rely on flexibility. And here is a key point that Boyd stresses, that in a different way Sun Tzu stresses, and that a number of other theorists of warfare stress. We need decentralization. In particular, we've got to have a decentralized set of decisions about tactics, even though we're going to need coordination with respect to strategy. Now, what's the difference between tactics and strategy? Tactics, that's directed toward particular actions. Or one way of putting it is, it's how do we do this? But strategy, That's directed toward, you might say, overall, not just individual campaigns, but the overall structure of the conflict. So that's a matter of, you might say, overall coordination, and a matter of then not how, but really what are we trying to do? And in the broadest sense, what kind of mix of these things? What are our objectives? So you might say, this is a question of what really are our objectives? And here, how are we going to reach those objectives? What are our goals? How are we going to attain those goals? Okay. We need to coordinate on strategy. We need to have objectives that make sense together. So partly this conflict is going to be a coordination problem, but partly we need to now, well, why is decentralization important? Why is it important to let the commander in the field decide? Or the person who's in charge of marketing to actually decide on the marketing strategy, rather than have top management having their hands in everything? Why is it important to let the local commander decide whether or not to take that hill, rather than having people in the White House, for example, direct all of that? If you think about our big military failures of the past few decades, they tend to be ones, like the Vietnam War, where all the decisions had to be made at the very top. One of my colleagues was a lieutenant in the Vietnam War, and he described the frustration of getting the command one day to take that hill. Okay, so the platoon attacks, they manage to secure the hill. The next day, the command comes, retreat from the hill, go back to where you were. Well, several people lost their lives taking that hill, but they do. Then a week later, they're told, take the hill again. Okay? All of that was those decisions were being made far away by people who were constantly interfering in people's local judgments of what made sense. So it was all this central direction of individual tactics. That's a recipe for slowing everything down, destroying flexibility, etc. Well, we've got a few seconds left. Any other things about how it's important to think about these wicked problems that have all of these difficult features? All right. Well, for next week, we're going to start talking about leadership, which is a really important element of coordination. In the meantime, think some about ways in which your own personal life faces you with wicked problems. These aren't always just large-scale corporate things or international conflict things. Sometimes they're like, how on earth am I going to get this degree? And I face information, intelligence, economic, financial problems, et cetera, et cetera. So
Military.
think about examples of that you encounter all the time.